I'm going to do something now that I haven't done before. All of the movies I reviewed on my YouTube page, except for were ones I reviewed while they were still in theaters, usually right after I saw them. I just posted earlier today. I uploaded my review of Horizon and American Saga. In that review, I explained why I waited. Now I'm going to review a movie that I saw recently, but that actually came out several years ago. In fact, this movie came out, I believe it was 10 years ago exactly. This movie was called Sin City: A Dame to Kill For, and it is based on the Sin City graphic novels by Frank Miller. Now, a couple things I need to say right off the bat. Okay, so if you're familiar with this franchise, you're probably aware that this franchise does contain some sensitive or objectionable themes. And when I say that, I mean I love Sin City more than I love life itself, but even I object to some of the stuff in it. And I try to keep my videos safe for work on principle. It's not about being monetized. Hardly anyone watches my channel. It's on principle. But so I'm going to allude to some things that I'm not going to say right out. And if you're familiar with the Sin City franchise, with the plot, with all this, you'll know what I mean. But I also think because to understand this sequel, you have to understand Sin City in general. So I'm going to give you guys some backstory because, I mean, I love the original. The original Sin City is one of my favorite movies ever. I think even someone who is not a fan of the franchise can and ought to enjoy the original Sin City. But I'm going to let you guys make that choice for yourself. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of backstory about, Sin City, it's kind of film noir. It's a very so it's based, obviously, like I said, on comics by Frank Miller, who is best known for his run on Batman for DC Comics, as well as Daredevil for Marvel Comics. Frank Miller, Sin City is neither. Sin City is Dark Horse, which is the same company that makes Hellboy. And Hellboy is not Frank Miller, it's Mike Mignola. But Sin City, it's drawn in a mostly black and white style. It's definitely meant to evoke classic film noir. It's very over the top in its approaches to a lot of things. It's definitely, I don't think it's something that's meant to be taken particularly seriously. It is set in a city. I keep reading online that the fictional, it's not set in Las Vegas. It's set in a fictional city called Basin City. And apparently there is an unincorporated area in Washington State called Basin City. And I've read online that that Basin City in the comics is in Washington State. I've read all the comics. I am not recalling anything in particular that says that it actually is in Washington State, but it's just a large, corrupt city in the American West. And there's all kinds of crime, violence, human traffic. Well, a particular district of town that is the result of human trafficking. And I'll let you imagine what that is. Probably won't be too hard for you to imagine what that means. But the drunkenness, street fights, everything. And since there are six main now. There are a bunch of different stories that Frank Miller's written, some of which are only 3 pages long, some of which are hundreds of pages long, that are all set in this city. And there's a cast of characters, and there are 6 main, I'm going to call them heroes, even though a lot of them aren't very heroic. There are other stories beyond these 6 that follow some random civilian, that follow one of the people who's out and out a villain, that are a lot shorter. But the 6 main heroes, quote unquote, you have Marv, the drunken ex-con. He's the most famous because his story is the most heavily featured in the original, and his comic, which was The Hard Goodbye, the one where he's the main character, was the first. There's Dwight, who's a street punk. Oh, sorry, Marv is played by Mickey Rourke in the movie. Dwight, the street punk, he's Marv's friend. He's, in my opinion, the least likable and least moral of the protagonists. Of the quote-unquote heroic protagonists. He's played in the original, he was played by Clive Owen. In this one, he's played by Josh Brolin, and I'll get back to that. There's Officer Hartigan, who's one of the only honest cops in the city. He's played by Bruce Willis. There's Nancy the dancer. She's the youngest of the quote-unquote heroes and the only female. She's played by Jessica Alba. In the movie, this guy isn't in the comics, but Frank Miller drew this up for the movie, so it's canon. There's a Johnny the Gambler, who's played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And then in the comics, there's also Wallace, who was a soldier. They didn't adapt his story. I think they wanted to make a third movie that they canceled because this movie didn't make much money, in which Wallace would have been the main character. And those are the hero. Some of them are a lot more heroic. Without question, Hartigan, Nancy, and Wallace are the most heroic. And then Marv and Johnny's probably in the middle. Marv and Dwight are the least heroic. They get away with stuff. Most of the people they fight, especially people Marv fights, are much worse. Also, nobody, including Marv himself, has any delusions that Marv's a good guy. Like I said, there's gritty noir anti-heroes, pumped with testosterone and cranked up to 11, that kind of stuff. And they have a lot of, and the main source of their enmity is the powerful family that built this city called the Rourke family. And who are led by a corrupt Senator Rourke. He's played by Powers Booth. So, that's the backstory on what Sin City is. So, each of the movies, both this one and the original, adapted a couple of stories that Frank Miller had drawn. For this one, they added 2 more that Miller wrote specifically for this movie. And, as the detailed description I just gave might suggest, you might be able to tell I love Sin City more than life itself, so there's no way I couldn't have enjoyed this film, but I think I definitely see how it does not hold up as well as the first. For one, I think the original simply adapted the 3 best stories that Miller ever wrote, and this one, some of them kind of falter. I think they made an enormous, I think their biggest mistake is that Hallenbach, which is the one that Wallace. So some of that Wallace, when I talked about the heroes, those it's not like they're a team of heroes. This isn't some Justice League Avengers type stuff. Some of those people don't know each other. Wallace has no interaction with any of the other people I listed. And some of the others have interaction with some of them. Dwight and Marv are close friends. Officer Hartigan saves Nancy's life in the first movie, and Nancy's story arc in this movie is basically she wants revenge on the Rourkes, who Hartigan saved her from Senator Rourke's son, and so Senator Rourke ruined Officer Hartigan's life. And if you want details, watch the movie or read a plot summary. And Nancy wants revenge on them for that. Anyway, the 3 that they adapt for the first movie were the best stories Miller ever wrote. I think they made a huge mistake here by making the main focus on Dwight. Because Dwight, of all of them, Nancy, Hartigan, Nancy, Hartigan, and Wallace, also Johnny, who isn't in the comics, are all somewhat heroic. And then Marv at least is fighting people much worse than he is. Dwight, I find the least likable. In the first movie, I actually do not see Dwight as the hero of his own story. In this movie, at least, he is fighting someone who is worse than he is. But I think Wallace's story is much more compelling. I think Hallenbach but does have a lot to do with Wallace being more moral, and the roadblocks to that. It's not about it not being in chronological order. Lots of this is not in chronological order because it jumps back and forth between different vignettes that aren't all happening at the same time. And also Wallace, I don't think it had to do it. And something else is they could not bring Clive Owen back to play Dwight. they got a new actor. Well, if that was the case, why didn't you just ask Josh Brolin as as Wallace and make Hellenbach the main feature? Which I've read Frank Miller, I guess, wanted Johnny Depp to play Wallace, and Depp would have been interested in playing Wallace if they'd done a third Sin City, but they didn't get around to it. I just think it suffers from the fact that a large portion of this follows the least likable of the protagonists of the major stories that you have in Sin City. I think while there were definitely a lot of enjoyable elements about the two original stories, one of which involves Johnny the Gambler and his feud with Rourke, and the other involves Nancy the Dancer and her rivalry and her quest for vengeance against Rourke. And the Joseph Gordon-Levitt definitely does a very good job, and as Johnny the Gambler. Powers Booth does an excellent job as the villain. So Nancy, like I mentioned, played by Jessica Alba. So Jessica Alba was always my celebrity crush when I was a kid. I do not have any delusions about her skills as an actress. It's not that she has no skills as an actress. She is very good at action scenes. She's very good at fight scenes and stunts and choreography. Apparently she has a Taekwondo black belt. So that is in real life. So she is good at pulling that off. But she does not have very much emotional range. And that's kind of a handicap when you're a professional actress. But in this movie, she actually, despite the fact that Frank Miller wrote a rather uneven script for her, she does actually, I think, pull off a pretty good performance as a Nancy who is bitter and angry and obsessed with revenge against the senator for what he did to Officer Hardigan, who's her hero, because he saved her. Now, and Jessica Alba pulls off an impressive, dramatic performance. I mean, it helps that there are only a couple emotions that she's feeling through the whole thing, and that she only has to be on screen for about half an hour to 45 minutes. But she pulls it off, and that's is I think one of the better performances. Like I mentioned, her performance, Powers Booth performance. I don't think any of the performances were necessarily bad. I just think her and Johnny, and of course the Powers Booth as the corrupt senator who is in both of those segments, are the highlights. And I just think the main story tying it all together kind of falls flat. A Dame to Kill For, which is the one involving Dwight. And Dwight, there's something else. Some of that Dwight's story in both of these. Because in the original, it was Hardigan versus Senator Rourke, or rather Senator Rourke's son, and it was Marv versus a different member of the Rourke family. And in the sequel, it's Nancy against Senator Rourke himself, and it's Johnny the Gambler against Senator Rourke himself. And Dwight's story was unrelated to the Rourkes. And in this one, once again, Dwight's story is the only one that is not directly related to the Rourke family. And that's true. In Hellenbach, Wallace's enemies are not part of the Rourke family either. Wallace's enemies are totally different. And I think if they had adapted Hellenbach instead, this would have worked a lot better. I also wonder if maybe just might have been that audiences, the original movie, even if you have a hard time stomaching some of the content, it's the original movie is just so well directed and stylish and all that you can overlook that. And if they'd come out with the sequel quickly, maybe they could have kept something going. But they took too long, and basically they produced an enjoyable but less satisfying version of the same movie that you already saw 9 years ago and were blown away by. Now you're seeing enjoyable but not as satisfying version of something you've already seen. That might have had a lot to do with why I didn't get good reception. In terms of the movie, I shouldn't, if you know anything about this or about most of the comics Frank Miller draws, you should know that this is not a movie to take a family to. Doug Walker, who you may know as a nostalgia critic, he called the original Sin City the most consistently violent movie he'd ever seen. Like, rarely did much more than a minute go without some act of violence. This movie, I think they have more quiet drama scenes with, violence being more of a threat lurking in the background, although it doesn't take long for the threat to emerge. But yeah, it's still very violent. Nudity is even worse than the original in that regard. Language, once again, something about Sin City that's interesting. The language is pretty clean for an R-rated movie. I mean, the language would be in both movies. It would be PG-13 if it were only about the language. It was other things. There might be the only two movies there are 2 of 3 movies I've seen in my life. There was Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter is another movie I've seen that did not get its R rating because of language. Like, did not have enough curse words or a certain specific word, didn't have enough of that to get the R. So I've seen 3 movies in my life that I can think of that got an R without having the language minimum for that. And 2 of those are the Sin City movies. So honestly, my thoughts on Sin City, A Dame to Kill For, are that if the sorry, lost my train. My thoughts, if you are a fan of the comics or of Frank Miller's work in general, probably should give it a try, although it might not satisfy you. If you're not a fan, I mean, it's ultimately up to you. Maybe if you're not a fan, give the original a try. And if you really like the original, maybe give the sequel a try. And that's my recommendation.